Just curious. What device are you watching on? Phone, TV, laptop? Comment below.
My husband handed me a cup of tea with a strange look on his face. It was too polite, too rehearsed, like he'd practiced it in the mirror. "Just something new I'm trying," he said, with that half smile he used when he wanted to seem charming but wasn't really in the mood. I smiled back, sweeter than honey, lifted the cup, and thanked him. I didn't drink it. Instead, I turned to Greg, his cousin, and handed it over like it was a peace offering. Greg had mocked me for years. He was the kind of man who thought his charm excused everything. His off-color jokes, his backhanded compliments, the way he once said, "I'd clean up well for someone like me," in front of Brian's entire family. That night, he had swaggered in with his new Rolex, bragging about some deal he'd closed, and made yet another snide remark about how I must have tricked Brian into marrying up. So when I handed him the tea and he grinned, I just smiled wider and said, "Figured you'd appreciate something different." 17 minutes later, Greg was pale, sweating through his shirt, gripping the table like it might anchor him to this world. The rest of the table went silent when he groaned and bolted for the bathroom, not quite making it. Vomit on the hallway rug. Knees buckled. Someone screamed, Brian's mother, I think. I stayed seated, calm, watching. The ambulance came fast, lights washing the walls in red and blue. Brian kept wringing his hands and repeating, "He's probably just sick, stomach bug, something he ate." His voice cracked near the end, and he looked at me too long. I held his gaze and said, "We all ate the same meal, Brian." I didn't sleep that night. He didn't either. He tossed and turned beside me, sighed theatrically a few times, got up twice claiming to use the bathroom. I listened for the click of drawers, doors, anything he might be checking. At 2:30 in the morning, he leaned over me and whispered, "Guess Greg couldn't handle the flavor. Shame." I kept my breathing even, eyes closed. When he went back to bed, I laid awake till sunrise, running through every little moment of the past 6 months. Brian and I weren't perfect. We'd hit our rough patches like any long-married couple. But this wasn't one of those patches. This felt like a test, or worse, a rehearsal. The next morning, I poured his coffee, gave him a kiss, and watched him drink it like it was any other Wednesday. He smiled, but it didn't touch his eyes. I asked if he wanted eggs. He said no, said his stomach felt off. I waited until he left for work, then took the mug from the sink. He never rinsed things properly. I scraped the inside with a Q-tip, sealed it in a plastic bag, and put it inside an old shoebox in my closet, just in case. That same afternoon, I got a text from Brian's sister. "Greg's stable. Docs say it might have been something toxic. Maybe herbal. He's doing tests." I thanked her and stared at the screen, rereading the word toxic until it felt unreal. The next few days were a blur of pretending. Me playing the good wife, Brian playing the doting husband. He made dinner twice. He never cooks. He offered to rub my back. I hadn't asked. He watched me eat more closely than usual. I started pretending to eat, slipping food into a napkin when he wasn't looking. Once I poured my wine into the potted plant behind the couch. I started noticing things, subtle, small. He'd hover by the kitchen when I was near the kettle. He started taking out the trash more regularly, unasked. Once I caught him staring at my phone when he thought I wasn't looking. When I confronted him about it, he laughed and said, "Can a man be interested in what his wife is up to?" He kissed my forehead like he owned me. That's when I really started watching him back. I made a list in my head. Odd behaviors, changed routines, the growing distance that wasn't physical, but something more suffocating. He'd always had a bit of a temper under pressure, but lately, he seemed tightly wound, coiled like a spring. The man who used to tease me in the mornings was now silent over breakfast. He didn't complain, he just observed, like he was waiting for something. 2 nights after Greg collapsed, Brian came home with a new tea set, ceramic, pretty blue glaze. I pretended to admire it and asked what inspired him. He said he wanted to try new things together. I asked if he wanted me to make us a cup. He said no, he'd do it. And when he handed me that first cup, steaming fragrant with that same too careful smile, I knew. He was testing doses, but so was I, testing trust, watching how far he'd go before I confronted him. I wasn't sure what was worse, the idea that he wanted to poison me or the fact that he might be doing it slowly, steadily, building up immunity in me like some twisted science experiment. The irony was, the moment he gave me that cup, he gave me the upper hand, because I never drank it, but Greg did. And now Brian knew that I knew. He just didn't know how much I'd seen. Not yet. I wasn't planning revenge, not right away. First, I had to understand what made a man like Brian cross that line, from love to malice, from shared life to secrets in ceramic cups. But one thing was already certain. I would never drink from his hand again. Not his tea, not his lies, and definitely not his apologies. The first time I realized something wasn't right was long before the tea, weeks, maybe months prior. It's strange how easily you can talk yourself out of your instincts, how you can tell yourself you're just imagining things, that you're being dramatic, overthinking, hormonal, whatever label makes your unease easier to dismiss. But looking back now, I remember how Brian started brushing me off in tiny, quiet ways that felt more like subtraction than distance. He'd smile at the right moments, touch my back as he passed by, laugh at my jokes when other people were around. But none of it lingered. It was all perfectly rehearsed, like muscle memory in a marriage that had become more routine than intimacy. He stopped leaving his phone on the counter. That was the first solid sign. We'd never been the couple who snooped, not really, but there was always a kind of unspoken openness about our things. Until suddenly, there wasn't. His phone was always in his pocket, face down if it was on the table. One night, I asked to borrow it when mine died during a call with the insurance company. He hesitated for just a second. So small I almost missed it, but I didn't. His thumb moved faster than necessary to clear something before handing it over. I pretended not to notice. That's what we do, right? We pretend not to notice until the pretending becomes heavier than the truth. Greg, his cousin, had been around more lately too. The two of them had always been close in that obnoxious bro club kind of way that made me roll my eyes at holidays. But lately Greg seemed bolder, not just with me, but in general. More smirks, more passive-aggressive remarks that Brian wouldn't correct. At one dinner, when I brought out dessert, Greg raised his eyebrows and said, "Look at you playing the good little wife. Bet you stir more than just sugar in his coffee, huh?" I looked to Brian, expecting even the smallest wince, a shake of the head, something. He just laughed and said, "She's got her own recipes." That night, I found a crumpled receipt in the dryer. It wasn't mine, and Brian doesn't do laundry unless he's trying to prove a point. The receipt was from a store I didn't recognize, some industrial place with a long technical name that didn't fit our usual purchases. The items listed were odd: a lab-grade funnel, a box of disposable gloves, something called tincture bottles, and an opaque vial set. I Googled the store. It catered to people making herbal extracts, small batch chemicals, even essential oil distillations. But Brian had never had an interest in any of that. He hated the smell of lavender. I tucked the receipt into a book on the shelf. I didn't know why yet. I just knew it mattered. From there, I started paying closer attention. I followed him one afternoon when he said he was meeting Greg for lunch. I waited 2 blocks from the restaurant and watched from my car. Greg showed up alone, no sign of Brian. 40 minutes later, Brian emerged from a storefront half a mile away, a blank brown bag in his hand, sunglasses on even though it was cloudy. He got in his car and drove home. I waited 15 minutes before following. When I got back, the brown bag was gone. He was in the garage fiddling with the tool bench, said he needed to reorganize it. I didn't ask questions. I just smiled and brought him a glass of lemonade. He kissed my cheek without looking me in the eyes. That night, when I took out the trash, I noticed an empty brown bag in the outside bin, crumpled neatly, almost too deliberately. The next day, I made an excuse about needing to meet a friend for coffee and instead drove to the storage facility listed on the earlier receipt. I told the front desk I was checking in on behalf of my husband. I wore one of Brian's old hoodies and used his name. The clerk barely looked up. He handed me a key card and told me Unit 117 was on the second floor. I walked in half expecting something cinematic, a dark lair, a stash of weapons, maybe a secret lover chained to the radiator if I was feeling dramatic. But what I found was a small, clean space with a single steel shelf. There were 3 cardboard boxes. Inside the first box was a mess of old photo albums and greeting cards, mostly from his college years. I flipped through quickly, looking for anything out of place, but they were normal. The second box held 2 burner phones, both off, both wrapped in tissue paper, like they were gifts. I pocketed them. The third box was locked. No key in sight. I left without signing out. Back home, I plugged in one of the burner phones with an old charger I found in the junk drawer. It powered up slowly, 5 texts loaded, all from the same number. No names. The most recent read, dissolve in warm liquid, taste disguised. Axe within 20. That was it. No follow-up. The others were just as cryptic. How much does she weigh? And too soon. You need to be sure. One just said, payment received. Disposal your responsibility. That night, I didn't confront him. I couldn't. Not yet. I needed to be sure of what I was dealing with. A man who wanted me dead. A man testing the waters, or something stranger, a kind of revenge that didn't even make sense yet. He came home late that night, said the guys had grabbed a drink after work. No apology, just information. I nodded. Watched him put his keys in the bowl by the door. Watched him glance toward the kitchen, then back at me. I was thinking, he said, peeling off his jacket. Maybe this weekend we take a little trip. Just the 2 of us. I smiled, nodded again, and said that sounded lovely. Because now I knew he wanted me alone, and I needed to know why. By the time the weekend rolled around, I had rehearsed my role so well that even I started to believe the performance. I smiled when I needed to, let him hold my hand in public like we were still in love, and leaned my head on his shoulder during the drive like a woman who felt safe, even though every mile we put between ourselves and civilization just made my stomach tighten. He'd booked a remote cabin about 2 hours outside the city, the kind with no neighbors, no reception, and too much quiet for someone who'd started seeing danger in the details. He called it reconnecting, and I called it an opportunity to either catch him in something undeniable or to finally find the answers I hadn't been able to dig up in silence. The cabin was charming on the surface. It had this old-timey wood stove and a clawfoot tub that probably hadn't been cleaned since the last snowfall. He lit a fire, poured us both some wine, and turned on that smooth jazz playlist he always defaulted to when he was trying to seem relaxed. I watched the way he poured my glass first, just a little fuller than his, and I felt it again, that strange tension between ritual and calculation, like every step had been planned in advance and he was simply sticking to a script. So I pretended to be distracted by the fireplace, watching the flickering orange light, while my hand gently knocked the glass onto the rug like an accident. I gasped, apologized, and promised to clean it up. He waved it off with that same tired grin and poured me another. I never touched it. That night, I waited until I heard him snore before getting out of bed. I moved quietly, barefoot on cold wooden floors, the moonlight just enough to navigate the cluttered little kitchen. I went to the trash first and found nothing unusual, just food wrappers and empty coffee pods. But then I checked his duffel bag. Buried under a pair of boxers was a small zippered pouch, the kind used for toiletries, but when I opened it, there was no toothpaste, no razor. Just a glass vial, a medicine dropper, and a sheet of printed instructions folded into quarters. I didn't take the vial, not yet. I took a photo of the instructions and returned everything as neatly as I'd found it. The next morning, I made us both coffee. I pretended to use the water he had prepped in the kettle, But instead I used bottled water from my bag, the one I'd been secretly refilling and keeping separate since I started suspecting him. He sipped his coffee slowly, asked me about my childhood like we were falling in love again. I told him stories he already knew, layered them with new details to make him believe I was softening. He smiled into his mug, eyes unreadable, and said he was glad we came out here. I said I was too. By the time we returned home, I had already uploaded the photo to a private folder and made an appointment with a friend of mine, Marie, a chemist who owed me a favor from back when I helped her get a job at a research firm. I brought her the mug from earlier in the week, sealed in a plastic container, and a swab from the zippered pouch. She didn't ask too many questions. Within 2 days, she called me. "What the hell is going on?" she asked, voice tight. I told her I couldn't explain everything yet, but I needed her to tell me what she found. She hesitated, then said, "Trace amounts of alkaloids, something plant-based. Not deadly in that dose, but it could cause disorientation, nausea, confusion. If taken over time, it might mimic symptoms of early cognitive decline." I sat there holding the phone in my lap after the call ended, my mind running wild with what that meant. Brian wasn't trying to kill me, not yet. He was trying to make me sick. Slowly, maybe convince me something was wrong with me, maybe get me declared unwell. I didn't know the full plan yet, but it was taking shape. And whatever the end goal was, it wasn't love or even hate. It was something colder. That same week, I went back to the storage unit. I'd had a copy of the key made from a photo I'd taken the first time. Cost me 2 favors and a strange trip to a locksmith in a part of town I hadn't visited in years. When I opened the lockbox, I expected bank documents, maybe photos, something nostalgic. What I found instead made my blood go still. There were several printed documents. One of them a life insurance policy in both our names, but the payout listed only him as the beneficiary. There were also notes, typed and dated, like journal entries or instructions. Wait until symptoms are consistent. Document everything. Another said, avoid emotional triggers. Stay calm, supportive. Reinforce narrative of fatigue. It was clinical, not passionate. Like I was a case study, not a partner. I took photos of everything, resealed the box, and left the unit. I didn't cry, I didn't panic, I didn't even shake. I just walked out into the sun and realized the man I married didn't just want out. He wanted out clean, with profit, and without the inconvenience of me being alive to ask questions. That night, I sat at our kitchen table, staring at the tea set he'd brought home, the ceramic glaze so perfectly smooth, it reflected the lights above. I could have smashed every piece of it. Instead, I brewed a cup of tea for him, with no poison, no drugs, no tricks. I handed it to him and watched him drink it. Then I smiled and said, "Just something new I'm trying." He raised an eyebrow. "Trying to poison me back?" he joked, then laughed. I laughed too, and I knew I was getting close. He didn't realize yet that the woman he thought he'd broken was gone. What sat across from him now was something different, calm, methodical, and no longer afraid. I hadn't seen Greg since the night he collapsed in our hallway, clutching the wallpaper like it could hold him together. After the hospital kept him for observation and pumped his stomach, he disappeared into one of those silent retreats he always mocked other people for attending. Probably under pressure from his wife or his insurance, or maybe just fear that he was finally facing consequences for a lifetime of smirking at other people's pain. When I texted him weeks later, using a tone carefully calibrated to sound soft, concerned, and just a little bit curious, I was shocked when he replied within 10 minutes. Not with words, but with a thumbs-up reaction. That was Greg. Even on the verge of being poisoned, still too much ego to type more than a gesture. I invited him over the following Saturday. Brian was scheduled to attend some leadership seminar hosted by his company, and I pretended not to care. Networking, he called it, buttoning his shirt with more enthusiasm than I'd seen from him in weeks. I watched him shave that morning, each movement mechanical, precise, and silent. When he finally left the house, I waited exactly 20 minutes before opening the windows, spraying air freshener, and pouring myself a glass of his favorite scotch, which I never drank. I set the bottle out like bait and waited. Greg arrived 15 minutes late, wearing a leather jacket that looked 3 decades too young for him and cologne strong enough to sting my eyes. He kissed me on the cheek like he always did, lingering just a little too long even now, and asked if Brian would be joining us. I shook my head and gestured to the chair across from me. Just us today. I figured we could talk. He took the glass of scotch without hesitation, sipped, and nodded approvingly. Damn, he really married a keeper. I didn't react. I just let that disgusting little compliment float between us like smoke and said, Greg, what happened that night with the tea? He blinked, caught off guard by the directness, but tried to cover it with a chuckle. Hell if I know. I was fine all day, then boom. Body turns traitor. Maybe I had some bad shellfish. You didn't eat shellfish, I replied. We had chicken, salad, mashed potatoes. I made the tea last minute, but I didn't drink mine. His smile thinned, and he set the glass down. What are you trying to say? I leaned in slightly, not to threaten, but to make sure he saw the seriousness in my eyes. I think Brian's been trying something new, something controlled, and I think he used you as a test. Greg let out a laugh that didn't quite match the panic flickering behind his eyes. You watch too many damn crime shows. Maybe, I said, but I also know about the burner phones in his storage unit, and the vial, and the instructions he printed. Do you know who Leah is? At the mention of her name, his face froze. Ah, I said quietly, so you do. He looked away for the first time since he arrived, took another sip of his drink, then rubbed his jaw like the weight of whatever he was holding in was physically aching him. Brian said it was just talk. He said he and Leah had a thing years ago and she was unstable. That she reached out again trying to get money, said she offered him some solutions to problems he didn't have. Did you believe him? Greg gave a bitter laugh. I wanted to. I mean, I've known him since we were kids. He's always been intense, but not like this. Then when I got sick, I started wondering. I nodded slowly. He handed me that tea, Greg. I didn't drink it. You did, and you almost ended up in the ground. Greg looked pale again, but not from illness this time. So why are you telling me this? Why not go to the police? Because I don't have enough yet, I said. And if I go to the police too early, he'll spin it, make me look unstable, make it all disappear. But you could help. His mouth opened, then closed. The idea of turning on Brian clearly shook him, even if he hated to admit it. What do you want me to do, psych? Just stay quiet. And if he ever says anything strange, anything threatening, I want you to record it. You owe me that much after years of snide remarks. Greg looked embarrassed, and for once he didn't try to joke his way out of it. Yeah, he said. Yeah, I do. He left without finishing his drink, muttering something about needing air. I watched from the window as he sat in his car for a full 5 minutes before finally pulling away. I didn't follow him. I had other plans that night. I waited until after dark, then took one of the burner phones and texted Leah. I used the same number that had been messaging Brian. I typed exactly what I thought he would say. Need more. She's still breathing. The reply came back fast. Not over text, you know that. Same spot. Midnight. I stared at the screen, adrenaline coursing through me, not because I was scared, but because for the first time, I was stepping into the heart of it. I wasn't watching anymore. I was becoming part of the deception, the back-channel whispering, the manipulation that Brian thought only he was capable of orchestrating. I was stepping into his world and doing it better. At 11:30, I left the house, dressed in plain clothes and no makeup. I parked 2 blocks from the location Leah had mentioned, an old dive bar on the edge of a closed-down industrial park, the kind of place where no one asked questions and people knew how to disappear. I waited inside until I saw her, tall, lean, a harsh jawline, and eyes that had clearly forgotten how to be soft. She didn't look like someone who'd been scorned by love. She looked like someone who'd survived a war. She sat down across from me without a word, just looked me up and down. You're not Brian. No, I said, but I think we both want the same thing. Her lips curved into the barest hint of a smile. Revenge? No, I said, justice, and maybe a little closure. She pulled a small cloth bundle from her bag, set it on the table, and slid it toward me. This is the last of what I gave him. I don't make that stuff anymore. Too many risks, but he wanted it bad. What was he planning? I asked. She shrugged, said he wanted a clean slate, told me you were already slipping, forgetting things, getting clumsy. I figured he was just going to fake some diagnosis, get the sympathy card. But when he started asking about dosage, I knew he was past the fantasy stage. I nodded, my fingers wrapping around the bundle. Thanks. Don't thank me, she said. Just make sure he doesn't walk away clean. I stood, left cash on the table, and walked out without looking back. That night, I put the bundle in the freezer. Not because I planned to use it, but because having it meant I now controlled the ending. Not him. For the first time in months, I slept soundly. The morning everything finally cracked open didn't begin with fireworks or sirens or even one of those sick gut feelings that coils around your spine like a warning. It started quietly, almost too quietly, with Brian humming in the kitchen. The man couldn't carry a tune to save his life, but there he was singing under his breath like someone who had no idea his entire world was teetering on the edge of exposure. I sat at the dining table pretending to scroll through the news on my phone while I watched him move around the kitchen like nothing had changed, as though the last few weeks hadn't been slowly unraveling the fantasy he had wrapped around himself for months, maybe years. He offered me tea again, same delicate ceramic cup, same sweet smile that didn't reach his eyes, and the same rehearsed charm he always used when he wanted to come across as thoughtful rather than calculating. It's jasmine this time, he said, placing the cup in front of me as if he were offering me a little piece of peace itself. Figured I'd try something different again. I looked up and thanked him, letting my fingers rest against the warm porcelain, but I didn't drink. I tilted the cup slightly, letting the scent drift toward me, and smiled as convincingly as I could manage. Smells lovely, Field, I said, and it did, just like the kind of trap someone like Brian would set. Beautiful, subtle, familiar, and just dangerous enough to make you question your instincts. He sat down across from me, crossed one leg over the other, and watched me with that look he wore. When he thought he was in control of the narrative, like he knew the next 10 moves and was just waiting for me to stumble into checkmate. What he didn't know, what he never seemed to suspect, was that I had been playing my own game in the shadows, collecting evidence, recording his words, tracing his purchases, and stitching together the trail of breadcrumbs he thought he had buried so well. I asked him about the storage unit, about why he needed it, pretending I had just remembered the bill that came in the mail. He didn't flinch, didn't even pause. Just lied as effortlessly as breathing, something about old business records and taxes and how I wouldn't be interested. I nodded along, said something bland about trusting him, and he reached out to touch my hand like he believed me, like my trust was still something he could manipulate and shape. Later that afternoon, when he went out for groceries, because he suddenly liked to shop alone now, I made the final calls. I sent everything I had collected over the last month to a lawyer friend of mine, someone discreet, someone who owed me a favor from years back when I helped keep his messy divorce from going public. I sent him copies of the text messages from Leah, recordings of Brian muttering about starting over, and even the photo of the insurance document naming himself as the sole beneficiary. I explained what I suspected, laid it out in clinical detail, and told him I needed a paper trail in case things went sideways. He didn't ask questions. He said, "I'll handle it," and hung up. That night, I decided it was time to end it, or at least bring it into the light where Brian would have to squirm in real time, instead of lurking in the shadows behind cups of tea and quiet lies. I made dinner the way I used to when we still had laughter in the house, and I played our old playlist, the one with songs that used to make us dance in the kitchen before everything started tasting like poison. He looked surprised but pleased, poured wine into our glasses, and lifted his in a lazy toast. To us, he said, with just enough irony to be unsettling. I clinked my glass against his and drank, finally, just a sip, just enough to show I wasn't afraid anymore. You know, I said, watching him as I set my glass down, I've been thinking a lot about how people can live in the same house and still live completely different lives. He raised an eyebrow, took a sip of his own, and leaned back in his chair. Is this about me not liking that cooking class? Because you're never gonna let that go, are you? I smiled, slow and steady, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. No, I said, this is about what happens when one of those people starts to believe the other is disposable. His expression flickered, just for a second, but I saw it. I saw the shift from cocky to cautious, from casual to calculating. What are you talking about? I reached into the drawer next to me and placed a flash drive on the table. I've been documenting everything, your receipts, your texts, your fake prescriptions, even Leah. She's not exactly loyal, you know. She talks. He didn't touch the flash drive. He just stared at it like it might explode. You've been spying on me? No, I said. I've been surviving you. He opened his mouth, probably to deny it, to spin some story about paranoia or stress or me being unstable. But before he could get the first word out, there was a knock on the door. He didn't move. I stood up, walked calmly over, and opened it to reveal 2 uniformed officers and a plainclothes detective. The detective stepped forward, polite but firm. Brian Russell, we'd like to ask you a few questions. Brian stood slowly, all the bravado drained from his face. He glanced at me once, no anger, no pleading, just calculation, like he was already crafting his next move in a much bigger game. As they led him out, he looked over his shoulder and said, "This isn't over." I smiled, still standing in the doorway, my hands steady, my voice even. No, I said, but the part where I play dumb is. I watched them drive away, the silence in the house suddenly different. Not peaceful, not yet, but lighter somehow, like something toxic had finally been aired out. I went back inside, poured myself another cup of tea from the kettle he had filled, and took a long, slow sip. 2 days later, I received a call from the detective. They had enough to press charges for attempted poisoning, insurance fraud, and several other felonies. But they also had questions. Questions about my fingerprints on the vial, my presence in places I hadn't officially explained, and how exactly I'd gotten in contact with Leah. I answered carefully, truthfully, but not completely. The day of his arraignment, Brian looked composed in that fake polished way he always did when he was cornered. He told the judge I was unstable, that I had planted evidence, that I had a history of emotional outbursts. His lawyer produced a timeline riddled with selective details, hoping to cast enough shadow to blur the edges of guilt. And maybe they would have succeeded, if not for one thing. Leah testified, and she didn't lie. Still, at the very end, when it came time to submit the final report, the DA paused. Because yes, my prints were on that vial. And yes, I had known about the poison long before I ever told the authorities. But what no one could ever prove, what remained locked away in the silence of my own memory, was whether I ever used it. Whether at some point I had wanted to match his darkness ounce for ounce and do more than just expose him. I never admitted anything, because I never had to. Justice came, heavy and slow like winter ice melting off a roof. But it came, and every time I lift a cup of tea now, I remember how close I came to becoming someone else entirely. But I also remember the silence that followed his last sip, the one I watched him take without blinking. I never said I didn't touch the poison. I just never said I used it the way he thought I would.